Sarada Chandra Sundaramukam Tamraravindeksham Bhaktabhishtavarabhayapradakaram Kaupinamatrojjvalam Svatmanandarasanubhuti vivasham Sarvanavadyangakam Shrimantam Shri Ramaneshwaram Guruvaram Yogasana Dhyasitam Dhyayet Shri Ramaneshwaram Dhyayet Shri Ramaneshwaram Dhyayet Shri Ramaneshwaram Hridaya Kuhara Madhye Kevalam Brahmamatram Yahamaham Sakshat Atmarupena Bhati Hridi Vishamanasa Swam Chinvata Majjatava Pavana Chalana Rodha Atmanishto Bhavatvam Namo Ramana. This Friday evening Atma Vichara session, we read from the book Self-Inquiry 1900 to 1950, where Bhagavan has answered all the questions put to him by his devotees on the subject matter of Atma Vichara, and it has been compiled for all of us by our founder, President Sri A.R. Natarajanji. And for the last few weeks, we have been looking at the section of questions that have been asked between 1936 to 1950. After reading the question and answer, the Upadesham that was given by Bhagavan, we will contemplate on the answer of Bhagavan by his grace. Then we will have a 20-minute Atma Vichara session, following which our President Sarada would be talking about Atma Vichara as it has been contemplated in Ramana Gita, and then we will have the concluding prayers to Bhagavan. This week's question that has been asked by the devotee to Bhagavan is how to get rid of fear. I repeat the question, how to get rid of fear. Bhagavan says, what is fear? It is only a thought. If there is anything besides the self, there is reason to fear. Who sees the second? Anything external. First, the ego arises and sees objects as external. If the ego does not rise, the self alone exists, and there is no second, nothing external. For anything external to oneself implies the seer within. Seeking it there will arise no doubts, no fear. Not only fear, all other thoughts centered around the ego will disappear along with it. I repeat Bhagavan's answer. What is fear? It is only a thought. If there is anything besides the self, there is reason to fear. Who sees the second? Anything external. First, the ego arises and sees objects as external. If the ego does not rise, the self alone exists, and there is no second, nothing external. Or anything external to oneself implies the seer within. Seeking it there will arise no doubts, no fear. Not only fear, all other thoughts centered around the ego will disappear along with it. Though the devotee, on behalf of all of us, is asking of this fear, and this fear is the biggest thing that we consciously or unconsciously deal every day. The fear is about losing the status quo. It is the status quo with which this ego or the mind is very comfortable with. And it doesn't want to lose that. Bhagavan is saying it is only a thought. As Bhagavan had said, the mind never wants to kill itself. It is a similar thing. The fear is only for the mind, and the mind is afraid because it doesn't want to lose the status quo. And what is that status quo? The status quo is that the mind wants to be outward turned and continuously experience objects. And why does it want to experience objects? The only reason that it wants to experience objects is because it wants happiness. And it is actually looking for that happiness, and it very strongly believes that this happiness that it is looking for will come one day or one moment somewhere from these objects. And therefore, it wants to continuously look for happiness in these objects. And in its belief, in its complete faith that it will find happiness in these objects, and therefore it wants to maintain that status quo. And because it wants to maintain the status quo, and if anything were to disturb it, it would find itself to be afraid of it. We may ask the question, in the sleep there is no objects, then the mind is not afraid of getting into the sleep. The only inquiry that we can find is because the status quo is restored after the state of sleep is over, that, as Bhagavan says, the one who goes into the sleep rises after the sleep as well. I, as Dileep, go to sleep and rise back as I, as Dileep only. And because the status quo is maintained, so I am not afraid even going to the sleep. But I am afraid of any activity, basically, wherein the mind, wherever there is laya, the mind is not much afraid. Whether we want to sit in meditation, whether we want to do some spiritual practices with maybe, japa, pranayama, wherever the mind is for a moment temporarily subdued, and then it can regain back its movements, there the mind, for those sadhana, the mind is not afraid at all. This has been an experience of all of us. And it has also been our experience that any momentary laya that we experience, even one-pointed attention to the work that we love, is nothing but a laya. Nothing but that the mind, all the other thoughts are subdued, and therefore the bhada, or what we call the effects of the thoughts of the mind, the pain that we experience with the thoughts, is subdued in because of that one-pointed attention, and therefore it is liked, therefore it is enjoyed. But then the mind knows that it can regain back its full vigor and continue to think, and therefore it is not afraid. When and where it thinks that it cannot regain that, that's when the fear starts. Like in death, that it cannot, it is uncertain, it doesn't know what it is seeing on the other side, then it may find itself to be at complete loss because of the uncertainty. It is afraid, it is fear. But Bhagavan is telling, but nonetheless, it is all nothing but a thought. Now, why do we go behind this object? We saw that because we have the mind has a strong faith that it will experience happiness through this outward turned attention to objects. It is the lack of vichara that the happiness is not in the objects, but it is in the self alone, that makes us not persuade the happiness within, but look for the happiness outside. Though the lookout is only for happiness, and the wrong knowledge that it is available in the objects is making this mind, the same mind, turn outward. Though it is a very uncertain area, the objects keep changing, it keeps looking for happiness outside. But if that mind understands that it is only looking for happiness, even in the outward thing, even a thought that we pursue, it is only because we want to gain happiness pursuing that thought. If we understand that we are only looking for happiness, and happiness is nothing but the self, happiness cannot be anything. So what we are really looking for, or what the mind is continuously looking for, is only nothing but the self. And therefore the great ones, Purandaradasa, they say that any activity that we do is nothing but like pradakshina, or even if we think or if we speak, everything we are doing for the sake of happiness. And therefore this is all archana of that one self alone. It is all nothing but the pujana, the chintana, the japa of the self alone. When we recognize that we are nothing, pursuing nothing but the self alone, then there is no fear. So that's what Bhagavan is trying to tell here. He is asking, if there is anything besides the self, there is reason to fear. When we recognize that it is only happiness, and in the name of happiness, we are only looking for the self, and it is always, every moment, we are the self, we are looking for the self, even through the body and the mind. When we recognize this, that there is nothing but the self alone that we are looking for, and the happiness that we are looking is ourself, and therefore there is no need to persuade through these objects and which are external. If we simply drop the entire external objects, because we are wrongly thinking that it is going to give happiness, but it is never. Simply, if you simply drop it, we are in the state of happiness only. And that recognition is what Bhagavan says here. First, the ego arises and sees objects as external. If the ego does not rise, the self alone exists. So even the ego we attend, because it is through the ego we want to experience the happiness, or it is the ego that is going to give the happiness. Everything which is objective is only persuaded because we want happiness. And when we recognize that that is not going to happen, and when we drop all of that, Bhagavan is saying what exists is self alone, happiness alone. There is nothing other apart from that happiness. So, for anything external to oneself implies the seer within. Suppose we cannot grasp this, we cannot understand it. Still, we are trying to hold on to object. Bhagavan is giving the remedy here. He is saying anything external means, any object that we are seeing means there is also a seer within who is seeing it. So he says, instead of seeing the object, if that is the habit which is still there, he says, instead of seeing the objects outside, if we can see the seer, turn our attention away from the object. If we have the faith to understand that we are only looking for happiness and the happiness is not in the object, but every time there is an object, a thought, or any form, there is an object that we are pursuing. All we need to recognize is there is a seer, and if we, instead of getting externalized, if we get internalized and look at the seer, then he says, seeking it there will arise no doubt, no fear. Then the thought, which may be fear, which may be anything else, the content of it is, we see that the content of that thought was persuaded only for happiness, but that happiness is in the seer, so turn inside, and then we see that we have achieved. And therefore, there will be no doubts, no fear. Not only fear, like that, all other thoughts centered around the ego will disappear along with the ego, because we see that the happiness is the natural state of the self, and there is no need for me to look for anything outside. The entire exercise of looking in objects was only for happiness, and that entire happiness is available to me if you simply start looking it outside. If you simply let go and turn every time within, and by repeatedly turning within and establishing ourselves in the happiness, it becomes clear for the mind, which is only looking for certainty, to find that certain happiness inside the self. So the same mind which was running outside will now start abiding in the self. That is why Bhagavan says to use this direct path of Atma Vichara, wherein every thought, when it rises and sorts of makes us believe that the happiness is in pursuing the thought, we should diligently inquire to whom is this thought. It becomes clear that it is for me, and thereupon we should inquire, who am I? Who is the seer of that thought? It is I. Who is seeing this I thought also? So every time there is an object, if we go to the seer, as Bhagavan is suggesting here, then all the thoughts, including the I thought, will disappear. And then when they disappear, what we experience is the peace, the happiness alone, the unalloyed happiness, the happiness which is not dependent on anything else. And it is found to be our real nature. And by this, the mind gets the taste of the self. The mind experiences the real happiness that it was looking for. And by repeatedly taking the mind and experiencing that peace, that happiness, Bhagavan assures that the mind will abide only in that self. The self-abidance becomes its natural lookout or natural state. With the immense grace of Bhagavan, with which alone we have come to this most direct path that frees us and from all the fear, all the doubts, all that externalization, and gives us the true experience of the happiness that we have been looking in the form of the self, which is our own nature. Let us do Atma Vichara for the next 20 minutes. to Sarada.
Namo Ramana. Prostrations to Ramana, shining as the self in all beings. By the immense grace of the self manifest as Ramana, we are meditating upon the path of self-inquiry revealed by him, and also have been blessed to sit in self-inquiry, to actually practice self-inquiry. In this part of the satsang, we are meditating on the answers of Bhagavan in Ramana Gita and their significance in the path of self-inquiry. We are meditating on the answers in chapter 3. Chapter 3 is Mukhya Kartavya Nirupanam. The questioner is Daivarata and the answers are by Bhagavan. And Daivarata has asked Bhagavan as to what is the most important duty, the highest duty cast upon a human being. And Bhagavan has answered that abiding in the self is the highest duty if one wants the highest. Mahadichata. So Bhagavan has said that if one wants the highest, then that is the highest duty. One is not prevented by nature or the Supreme from striving for the highest. If one wants the highest, then no other duty is cast upon one which will prevent one from striving for that. This is what Bhagavan is telling us very compassionately. That if we want the highest, we have the full freedom to pursue the abidance in the self, and we would not have been disregarding any duty of ours by doing so. This assurance he is given. Then Daivarata asked him, how is one to abide in the self? Bhagavan said, to take the mind away from all objects. Vishayebhya paravritya vritti sarva prayatnatah. Keep making the effort to take the mind away from objects and put it into the kevalam vimarshe kevalam tishted achale, unmoving, nirupadhike, without any of the upadhis, that which is the pure stillness, one must abide in that. Then Devarata asks further, all right, we are practicing abiding in that stillness and we may come in and out of it. So while one is in the stage of practicing self-inquiry, practicing self-abidance, should one continue to observe all the rules of conduct, niyamas? Should one continue to observe the niyamas? And Bhagavan says, yes, during the practice one should continue to observe all the niyamas, and once one has attained steady self-abidance, one becomes kritakritya, siddhana kritakrityana galanti niyamas swayam. All the rules fall off of their own accord. There is no conscious effort to drop or contradict any niyama. This is what Bhagavan said. So we were looking at what are the niyamas, what are the rules of conduct. There are several rules of conduct as we see. The Vedas say, Satyam Vada, Dharmam Chara, live in accordance with Dharma, speak the truth. Okay, then do Swadhyaya, do study, do practice. All this is, there are the injunctions given to us by the scriptures. Then there are the injunctions in the Ashtanga Yoga. If we look at the word niyama, it immediately takes our mind to the Ashtanga Yoga, where we have yama and niyama, and then of course we have pranayama, asana, and then all that we have. But the word niyama. So what are the niyamas which are prescribed in Ashtanga Yoga? If we look at that, there are 5 niyamas which are prescribed in Ashtanga Yoga. The 5 niyamas begin with saucha, cleanliness, purity. Of course, it is not only about external cleanliness, it's about cleanliness of the mind. So one must practice purity of the mind. Well, how should one practice purity of the mind? Self-inquiry itself ensures purity of the mind. The practice of self-inquiry brings about internal suchi or cleanliness. Absolutely, certainly, it brings about cleanliness of the mind, purity of the mind. Because what is impurity? If we say milk is not pure, what does it mean? It means something other than milk has been added to it. Water has been added to the milk. So the milk has become impure. Or some other items have been added, the milk becomes impure. When water is added to the milk is no longer pure because something other than the milk has become a part of it. So that which is not natural, that which is an upadhi, that which is added on is impurity. We used to have competitions for school children. And we used to have essay writing competitions. And that one child, she wrote about the purity of the mind. Very sweetly, she wrote, saying that, you see, people talk about cleaning the Ganges, the Ganga. And what does one have to do to clean the Ganga? What does one have to do to make Ganga pure? All one has to do is stop polluting. Stop throwing in things into her. Stop polluting her, and she remains pure by her nature. So Bhagavan says the mind is pure by its nature. Pure by its nature. It becomes impure due to association with various thoughts, various habits. That's how it becomes impure. And what does one do in self-inquiry? One questions all the associations and allows them to drop away. Every thought is actually an impurity because it is not our nature to think. Bhagavan says, thinking is not your nature. Since it is not our nature, thought itself is impurity. It's not that there are pure thoughts and impure thoughts. Thought itself, because thought is impurity, because thought is dependent on the thinker. A thought arises for me because I think I am a particular entity. And I think these are my thoughts. My thoughts. Now, that entity is an impurity because that entity is not even a reality, but if we see it as a reality, it is an impurity. The ego, we call it. That is the basic kalmasha, that is the basic impurity. So every thought, since it is associated with the I-ness, which is in itself a mixture, which is not pure, which is therefore impure, although it has an absolutely pure basis, absolutely pure element, it springs from the self. It has got the I amness in it, but it mixes the I amness with something else and therefore becomes impure. It mixes it with a name, with a form, with an identification. So the self-inquiry is the most purifying process because it completely cleanses us of all association with thoughts to begin with, by questioning for whom are these thoughts and turning attention away from the thoughts to the thinker, and then further by asking, who am I? The impurity of associating with the non-self is also completely cleared. So if we want to follow the niyamas also, self-inquiry would be one of the best forms of following saucha, cleanliness. Then what are the other niyamas? The second one is santosha, to be happy. What better source, what better means of being happy than to do self-inquiry? In a further chapter, chapter 7, Bhagavan will emphasize sarva klesha nivritti syat phalam atma vicharata. The fruit of self-inquiry is the destruction or the release from all sorrows, all difficulties. But to begin with also, we need to be happy. If we are completely caught up in thoughts, if there's so much of impurity, our mind may not turn towards the inquiry. So we need to get back and we need to have a certain joy. If we are caught up in conflict, in anxiety, the mind doesn't easily turn to its source. If we are happy, if we are contented, if we feel that we've got everything that we need to in life, nothing further to be attained, then the mind says, now what? Everything that I need to get, I've got, I'm happy. Now what? What next? The only thing that remains is to find out who I am. So let me turn with it. Let me go to that. One way is to come to self-inquiry from sorrow and then find the joy through the self-inquiry. Another way is to come to self-inquiry from happiness, from santosha. Understand, so much santosha I have got by merely being in this world, by merely experiencing a few events which are passing. What must be the bliss of the self? So when one is happy also, one can turn within without any disturbance. So in that sense, one must practice contentment. One must remain happy. And then there is santosha and there is tapasya, discipline. Bhagavan says, self-inquiry is the performing the greatest penance. Because he says, tapaha, no? In Upadesha Saram, he says, this is the great tapas. This is the great tapas. Which is that tapas? That tapas of turning within. So one must perform the tapas. Performing self-inquiry is the tapasya. Tapasya, the word tapas also means burning. Burning. And every attribute gets burnt through self-inquiry. That's why it's called the greatest tapas by Bhagavan. So the niyama of self-inquiry itself, practicing self-inquiry includes everything, all the niyamas. So if we feel we need to practice the niyamas, by practicing self-inquiry, we would be practicing all the niyamas. We would be practicing saucha. We would be practicing contentment, joy, because we are happy with the self. We don't need anything additional to it. We are not seeking anything else. We are happy by just the self itself. What greater contentment can be there? And then it is the tapasya, because it burns away everything that is unnecessary, everything that is added on. All impurities are burnt. And swadhyaya is one of the niyamas. That is to say, one must study. One must spend time in study. Swadhyaya, one of one's own accord. But here, swadhyaya is study of the very self. We are studying the self. Bhagavan says, without knowing the self, what use is it to know anything else? Thannai aridalindri pinnai yadarihilan. What is the use of knowing anything other than the self? What is it of knowing? What knowing is it? In other context, in Ulladu Narpadu, he says, Soppanamar Siddhigale. To know anything else is just like knowing something in a dream. So, knowing the self, paying attention to the self, studying the self, by inquiring into the self. Inquiry is the best means of study. So, studying the self, by inquiring into the self, would be the best swadhyaya. And then, Ishwararpitam buddhi should be there. That is the fifth niyama, which is said, Ishwara pranidhana, to surrender to Ishvara. And what greater surrender than to surrender every thought to the self and to the surrender the very I by asking, who am I? One is ready in self-inquiry to make the complete surrender. So Bhagavan says, follow the niyamas. One need not worry. There are so many niyamas to follow. There are 5 niyamas to follow. How will I ever achieve each one of them? When will I do tapasya? When will I be able to overcome the impurities which are there in my mind? Because so many impurities are there, we do not even know. There's only the tip of the iceberg that we see, if at all we perceive any impurities. Chandrasekhara Bharati Swami says that the Puranas indicate in the Satya Yuga we have Hiranyakashipu and the Varaha Avatara. They were in different lokas. The Devas were in different lokas, the Asuras, the Danavas, the bad people were in different lokas. Then if you take during Ramavatara, they came into the same loka, Ravanadis and then Sri Ramachandra. And if you take then again in Dwapara Yuga, in the Mahabharata, they came into the same family. And he says, what about the Kali Yuga? They are within every individual, the good and the bad. We see both impurities and purities. But Bhagavan, as Nandakumarji says, does one bunching, he does clubbing. He says, all the thoughts. If we are going to try and find out which is good, which is bad, which is good, when to examine the thoughts, when to find which is bad and when to throw it away. To know it is bad, first one has to see it, one has to countenance it, one has to look at it, one has to pay attention to it and then realize, oh my God, this is a bad thought, and then throw it away. Better not to take the risk at all. Why allow it that much of time and attention, says Bhagavan. Even before it rises, do away with it. Even before it rises, do away with it in self-inquiry. Such is the beauty of Bhagavan's compassion. Such is the magnitude of Bhagavan's compassion that he wants to take us back to the self alone. And everything is included in that. When we do self-inquiry, he has already said it is the highest duty to abide in the self. In case we are having any other doubts like Devarata, should I follow any other injunctions? Should I follow something? All other niyamas will automatically fall into place. For one who is doing self-inquiry, of course, steadily, as tapasya, it has to be done. As swadhyaya, the inquiry has to be done. With joy, santatam shalipara santoshamahave, says Bhagavan. With joy it has to be done. Done continuously. When that is done, automatically everything else is taken care of by the Sadguru. Automatically the divine takes care of everything that the person has to do. Whatever needs to be done will automatically get done through that person at the right time without having to pay any extra attention to it, without worrying about it. So let us, by Bhagavan's grace, hold on to the self. Let us hold on to the self through self-inquiry, and that grace which is come to us, which has revealed itself to us, in order only to take us back to itself, will certainly fulfill its task Om Namo Bhagavate Sri.
Namo Ramana. Thank you, Akka. Apara Satchit Sukhavarirashi Yasyormimatram Bhuvanam Samastam Guhahitam Tam Ramanam Gabhiram Chinta Vihinam Hridi Chintayami Chinta Vihinam Hridi Chintayami. Namo Ramana. Thank you all.
Namo Ramana. Thank you, Dileep. Namo Ramana to everyone.